of dialogue around the work. So in a way, it's that impossibility which I feel I'm interested in, is like, how do you strip a place of its specificity, but ultimately accept that those connotations and associations are embedded in that kind of original source material when you put a few places together.
Do you see, you lecture at different universities, do you see a reverses happening? Do you find an influence of the work by the Latin Americans who are here, whom there are many in London particularly? Do you see it influencing backwards onto your work, being reflected by your work on theirs, or is it not at all like that?
I don't really know if I could answer that. Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that.
Okay. Right.
But I guess what I can say is that actually when I first started teaching, just after I finished at the Royal College, and I had to do lectures about the history of photography, and it really struck me how Eurocentric, and it was all about obviously the French and the British, and it was somehow like Latin America didn't even exist in the whole conversation. And so even though I was really aware of that as someone that grew up in Venezuela, I felt that somehow it was too complicated for me to try and insert it somehow into the lectures, and I felt a bit guilty about that. It was like, oh, I'm just going to gloss over that. And so that's something that actually this panel today has made me kind of think about in terms of the future, and how actually it is really important for me to do more research into the history of photography in terms of Latin American art, and to try and reinsert that into this wider history.
Well, this is precisely what you're working with. Tell us a little bit about the Tate project work you've done that's still there. I recommend you all go to have a look.
Yeah, with the project space?
Project space.
Yeah. So the exhibition that I have on at the moment at Tate Modern, this is the poster for it, you may have seen. It's called A Chronicle of Interventions. And it's part of the Project Space series, where Tate works with a partner institution from another region. And in this case, we had never worked with Central America before. And in fact, none of the curators in my department had ever even traveled to Central America. For many reasons, but this was really the first opportunity to, first of all, go to Central America and do an extended residency program. I went to Panama, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, and then work with a really important arts institution within Costa Rica. So we collaborated with Teoretica in San Jose, and Teoretica is an institution that throughout the 2000s, over the past 15 years, they've really concentrated on developing and showing contemporary artists from the region, but also bringing in international artists within that context. So the show that's on at the moment, I should talk about the residencies actually. So being an outsider going into Central America for the first time, after the immediate residency period, I sat down with my co-curator, Inti Guerrero, who is Colombian but now works in Costa Rica. And the first thing we discussed was the fact that all three countries were totally different. And actually, it has this label of Central America, but there was nothing that we could find to make it feel cohesive. Because, I mean, come on, it's a group of countries in the same region. Central America essentially means nothing. So that was really our starting point. If there's no if the shared geography actually doesn't bring together a theme, what are the other overarching themes that bring all of these artists together? And from the studio visits we did, ranging from artists in their 50s and 60s to artists that were just out of university, there was this ongoing theme and discussion about the political history and the history of foreign intervention within Central America. So that really became the starting point for the theme of the show. And there's 7 contemporary artists talking about the history of foreign intervention into Central America. But what I should also say about that is that that theme, we could have placed that theme much more globally. We could have done a global show about the history of foreign intervention into, other countries, yeah. So we were really trying to look for a theme that was much more global to bring all of these artists together.
Do you want to pick up? Would you like to pick up on what you're talking about, the politics of that era and the development out of it?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say a short sort of introduction slash preview of a show I'm working in for the end of this year. My interest with the UK and Europe begun because of researching on the 19th century, the first explorers that went and not only, there's expeditions of draftsmen and watercolors, but the first expeditions with photography, I always have thought the Europeans, but also the English, or especially the English, were very curious and very meticulous in their recordings. I'm now working on a show of original prints in 1893 of a voyage in the Amazon through Brazil. And there's this sense of discovery, there's this sense of trying to understand, there's this sense of trying to make sense of this absolutely wonderful but crazy world that they encountered, that I think still you can find it not only through artists that go and work in Latin America and come back, but also through research, through galleries that show Latin American art. There's a constant effort to try and make sense of the really complex, not only political but social, cultural, artistic histories of the different regions and the different countries, and this sort of active curiosity is very, it's very exciting for a curator or for a researcher like myself. So there's always plenty of ideas, plenty of projects, plenty of interest in the art world here, and especially within the photography world. To revisit, to review, to study, to try and understand that. I think sometimes you have to get away from Latin America, you have to get away from your own country, you have to get away from your own context to be able to really see from afar and understand it. And it's been an amazing process of rediscovering my identity and rediscovering my own continent from afar.
So when you go back to Colombia, presumably you do go back.
I try to, yeah.
Do you find that you fit in, or do you find an awkwardness about going back with your kind of mental visions of photography and the work that you work with?
It's very difficult when you go back to fit in. I see sometimes. I change my chip like a mobile phone. I put on another chip and I behave differently, and I go into this other world. You have to. If you behave like you behave here, you'd be completely out of place, and you'd be completely estranged, and the other way around as well. So you have to learn that there's a completely. It sometimes takes days or weeks. People call it jet lag. I just call it, just different universes. You get up from this plane in this other country where things just work essentially in a different way.
I suppose I meant in terms of
Yes.
when you go to galleries or you see photography there or you see other artworks, are you finding it so completely different from here? Or is it?
It's very particular when you take a work out of a context and you put it in a different context, how it changes. Especially with Latin America, or especially in the context of an art fair or a gallery, this shift in context sometimes really kind of changes the meaning of the work, and you really have to work on explaining and understanding the context of it for it to make sense. And that's why I've tried to sort of go more for projects where there's a curator, where there's a consensus about the narratives around the works. But at the same time, the sheer quality of the works sometimes makes them work on a universal scale. I think that the best works transcend local narratives to become quite universal.
Do you find that, Daphne, when you go back to Caracas, do you find that strange phenomenon mentally?
Absolutely. When you were talking, I was nodding because I can completely relate, and I call it. I mean, I think it's culture shock as well, and I think that's the thing as well about London, and how I've always said that London is the one place I feel where I don't get culture shock. When I go back to Venezuela, it takes me a few days to adjust. And obviously, from thinking in English, I start thinking in Spanish. And the same happens when I go back to Israel. And I think there's just something much more particular and specific culturally about those two places. And maybe it's also to do with the politics. Like both of those places are quite loaded politically. And that's something that really is felt through the everyday. It's kind of always there, whereas I feel when I'm in London, it's just much more neutral in that sense, and you can't really pinpoint a particular culture, or it really truly is diverse in that sense. So as soon as I get back to London, I feel very much at home and quite comfortable. Whereas in the other places, it's about negotiating different cultural codes. But obviously, I mean, it also, when I first arrived here, it struck me that even though I spoke English, I felt like I was speaking a different language, because I would get on the bus and I would ask for something, and the bus driver would look at me as if I was speaking in Spanish. So you know, it's interesting what happens when you've been somewhere and how you assimilate certain kind of codes and alter your behavior. And there is, when you kind of move between different places, how you feel slightly schizophrenic in that sense, where you're kind of putting something on and then taking it off. And so that's, again, something that I feel carries through into the work that I make.
But also, I mean, the two countries you're talking about, the works being produced there, the photography there is very, very different. I mean, the political level of photography in this country is quite low, relatively. There was a period when there was a very heavy political London-based politics and photography. It's much less so now, but you're talking about places that affected that.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Could I just add to that? When we're talking about taking things out of this context, this Latin American context, when we're in London, I think we also, I as a curator, we have to think a lot about the audience, the London audience, what they know, what they don't know, and how we communicate to them in order for them to understand things, and in order for them to understand these very, very complicated political and social historic situations. And just a recent example of how much we really have to think about what the audience doesn't know, in a way, is we had an exhibition recently of the American photographer Harry Callahan, who in North America and mainland Europe is an extremely well-known, pioneering, influential photographer. It was his first exhibition in London, and I mean, he was making work from the 50s right up until the 90s. And many, many people came and said to me, "Who is Harry Callahan? Why is he so important?" So if you think of the London audience not even recognizing a very well-known North American figure, then you begin to understand the extent of how much context we have to create for Latin American photography. And in 2012, we had a display of Manuel Alvarez Bravo. And that was, I mean, we really have to start from those pioneering figures in a way, and to show historic work, these pioneering figures, to introduce the history of Latin American photography. And then also to integrate in with more contemporary things.
When there was first the collector, who was Simon Baker joining the Tate to get collections, August Sander was one of the first exhibitions he showed. And it was great because it was so simple. It's just a portrait of somebody standing against a wall, or two people, or somebody in a baker shop. It was a brilliant idea because, like you say, it had to be the beginning of the historical process of photography. I wanted to move on to something now, which is about two separate things, which are both separated from the countries we're talking about. Brazil, for instance. I want to talk to you three about this. Brazil is outside of this in such a way. You're talking about a different language with the rest of Latin America, and you're talking about the process of art, including photography, obviously. Photography is much less of a constitution of the art world in Brazil. It's much more conceptual, much more installational and so on. I just wonder what you think about this, because there's very little here. I don't think there's anything in this show that's Brazilian. And then there's another aspect to it, which we'll talk to Tonchi Vasquez, who's sitting there in the middle, who is a Puerto Rican New Yorker, a New Yorker actually. It's interesting that New York has got a big photography scene, and there's a Museo del Barrio in Upper Manhattan, in the Spanish Harlem. You know, you hardly ever get it talked about. There was a big article in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, which was about the fact of the history of the director of the Museo del Barrio, and how it's just never seems to work somehow. And it's been going on, and people have come and gone about 5 or 6 times in the last few years. And it's really interesting. It's a sort of isolation in the middle of Manhattan, in the middle of a centerpiece in photography and art and so on, and there it is uptown, it's not going on. So when we go around and see these photographs, we can talk about something to do with that. But I'd just like to get you just to talk a little bit about those two places where we've got this sort of isolation, if you want to, because we've got different countries we're dealing with.
Well, focusing on the history of photography, I think from my point of view, there's two countries or two regions that really stand apart from the rest of Latin America, and that's Brazil, obviously, and Mexico. They both have such a rich, long-standing tradition within photography, and even when photography started becoming more accepted within the art world, such a strong internal market within Brazil, within Mexico. They've got such a clear vision of their own nation and what they've built through the 20th century as Brazil or as Mexico, and they've really kind of backed it up with imagery, with photography, especially Mexico with photography, defining themselves as a nation, which is very interesting. But Brazil clearly follows in the footsteps, especially, well, my expertise is 19th century when they rivaled France and the UK or England, and say no, we invented photography. For me, it's a classic Brazilian, a beautiful Brazilian. That, you know, everything is o mais grande do mundo, o maior do mundo. But he is, yes. But you know, but they claimed it as, you know, he was here, he was doing these things in Brazil, he was doing heliography here. So it was a good friend. And you're Brazilian, yeah. Of course.
I'm a photographer, and my name is Marcio Scavoni. And my dad was contemporary to Geraldo de Barros. I was in a discussion a couple of months ago because my dad's photographs are in the collection as well. I parachuted here, two great friends, you know. I was very interested in about what you said on. I'm being a photographer in my own right, yeah. I have struggled all my life against regionalism in my own way. Yeah, I'm very well known for my portraiture work in Brazil, but I've done books and essays and stuff. And what I've been working, I mean, nowadays, this is why I was smiling at you. It's all about the mental geography of the photographer. I decided I'm old enough to do what I want, so I'm back to what photographers have always done, which is multiple exposures and stuff. And it's all started with a Leica monochrome camera that Leica sent to me, and I said to do an essay to launch this camera, and I decided I could put images on top of the other and tell my own story, because there's, you know, everybody's photographed everything already, you know. So I'm very much into this